Thanks, Kristen. Yes, thank you all for joining us today. As we present our progress that our working group has made, we're going to start off with a little introduction, a little bit about the science and the motivation behind our group, get you up to speed on our group members and our group goals. And then we'll move into our results and outcomes, group by topic or objective. So we have the CLIVAR working group on the changing width of the tropical belt, and it's actually a point of discussion of what we mean when we say tropical belt. It means different things to different people. So I think most often in our group, we are thinking of the three-cell model of the atmosphere when we say the width of the tropics. In particular, we're talking about the width of the Hadley cell and its related surface climate features. So in the three-cell model, you have the thermally direct Hadley cell, including convergence and ascent at the equator. Moist ascent, the intertropical convergence zone, is a feature of that component of the tropical circulation. And the circulation diverges aloft and subsides in the subtropics, the region of the subtropical highs. When people study the changing width of the tropics, we're usually talking about this Hadley circulation. So not just the deep, moist tropics, but also the dry, arid subtropics. Debatably, it may be termed the widening of the subtropics. But depending on which metric you look at for the width of the tropics, maybe you could look at the Hadley circulation itself from a zone mean stream function, or you could be looking at the latitude of the pressure maximum subtropical ridge. Depending on the metric you look at, you see different things. Depending on the time period you're looking at, you see different things. And altogether, this has produced some confusion in the literature over just how much the tropics have expanded, how much of that is due to human activity, and how that will continue into the future. So we formed to address some of these questions. And so here's a list of our working group members. The red names are also part of a related working group, the International Space Studies Institute based in Bern, Switzerland. And many of us are part of that working group as well. That working group is focusing exclusively on the metrics of tropical width. So Kevin and I are bolded there with the co-chairs. This picture was taken at our first working group meeting in Bloomington, Indiana in 2017. And the goals of our working group, main objectives, are one, to provide guidance on which metrics are most appropriate to quantify the key impacts with changing with the tropical belt. Metrics are being introduced one after another in literature, and different conclusions are being made based on the different metrics. And back at a Chapman conference, we agreed that we needed to provide some guidance on which metrics you should use to study what aspect of the circulation. The second objective is to identify how human activities and natural variability contribute to the changes that we've seen and the changes we expect in the future. The third is drilling this down to a regional level and the level of impact, because you experience impacts at a regional scale, not necessarily on a global scale. And the fourth objective is to coordinate with other programs, and we've already done that with ISSI. So again, we formed in 2016. We had our first workshop in Bloomington. It was in late 2016. And we had a couple of joint meetings here in Gray with ISSI, and the synergy with that group has actually been terrific. It's been nice to have the meeting with ISSI and then come back and fill in the rest of our CLIVAR group members on what ISSI members have been working on and what conclusions they've been coming to. Workshop number 2 was in Boulder, Colorado, and we started solidifying our timeline for the papers that we were hoping to write, when we were hoping to write them. We had our AMS annual meeting in Texas in January this year, and just recently we had an ISSI meeting 2 in Switzerland. And through the course of our telecons and our working group meetings, it's been great to see that this working group timeline is basically the same presented a year ago, and we've been right on track with these with the goals of writing and submitting and revising the papers. So it's satisfying to look back and see our timeline and be able to check these off one by one and say, yeah, we're actually doing pretty good. We have an AGU meeting coming up this December. Got a session created, got our speakers invited, and the next several months we'll be revising some papers, submitting a couple more, which I'll tell you about later. So far, with our Boulder meeting, we also had a public lecture in Boulder, which is a nice way to reach out. Our AMS session went pretty well. Ori Adam created Trop D software. Kevin will tell you about that. Darren Waugh has a good paper on metrics, which is a great synthesis. Kevin has just barely submitted a synthesis on variability. We have our U.S. Collaborative Variations newsletter we'll tell you about in a bit, and of course our AGU session coming up. Here's a link where we go watch the UCAR Community Programs seminar, and it's similar to the presentation we gave last year here on the webinar, but it's more detailed on the science. Our AMS session was a good way to reach out. We have several people inside our group who presented and several outside our group as well. It was a great way to connect with others in the community and further our discussion. So that's what we have been up to so far. Kevin will tell you a little bit more about some of these as he presents on the first 2 objectives of our group, as he talks about the science of that.
All right, well, thanks, Paul, for the nice introduction to our group. So I'm going to take over here for a little bit and discuss sort of the progress that the group has made over the last several years to some of the science objectives in the working group. So to start with here, okay, got my pointer working. To start with here, we're going to talk about the first objective, which was quantifying the width of the tropics. So by how much have the tropics widened in the last, say, 30 to 40 years. And so if you look back in the literature, you find a lot of studies like this. So this plot is from a paper from Sean Davis and Karen Rosenloff, who are both members of our working group, and this was back in 2012. And at the time, they were trying to sort of incorporate and kind of catalog all the measurements of tropical widening that had been in the literature, as well as develop some new ones of their own. And what you can see here is just the wide range of estimates across different studies. So some studies, have virtually no widening over this period from 1979 to 2009. In other words, suggesting basically the Hadley cell edges have been sort of in the same location on average. Whereas other studies are suggesting a widening of up to sort of 2 and maybe even 3 degrees per decade. So there's this huge discrepancy in sort of how much widening has been documented. And so we've had a lot of discussion about how do we reconcile plots like this, and how do we reconcile all these different estimates of how much the tropics have widened. And so we came up with sort of 3 things that are, I think, somewhat useful to talk through. The first is basically just a physical understanding of how all these features that are kind of all near 30 degrees latitude, how they all relate to one another. The second is sort of defining some standard methodology for how you should calculate these things. And then finally kind of dealing with the fact that different data sets give you different answers. And so we've made quite a bit of progress in terms of the working group in addressing these issues. And so I'll talk sort of through these here in the next 10 minutes or so. The first one is dealing with different metrics. And as Paul mentioned, Darren Waugh his paper is actually just accepted in Journal of Climate. And it's a nice sort of synthesis and overview of the sort of physical relationships between all these different metrics that studies have used to measure sort of where the edge of the tropics are. So traditionally, we'd like to think of the edge of the tropics as just where basically the Hadley cell ends, which is this psi metric or the stream function metric. But to calculate this requires vertically integrating the winds throughout the depth of the atmosphere. And unless you have climate model data or data from reanalyses, those are really the only two methods that you can calculate the stream function. And so if you want to do it just based on surface measurements or radiosonde measurements, then you need to use, or satellite measurements, you need to use a different metric. And so a number of studies have looked at things like the surface wind field, so the transition between tropical trade winds and mid-latitude westerlies, looking at the subtropical highs, looking at the edges of the dry regions, so where net evaporation transitions to net precipitation. Other studies have used radiosonde observations and looking at tropopause height, so where the tropopause is higher in the tropics and then transitions to lower heights in extratropics. It's sort of that break in the tropopause people have used, and that's very closely related with the jet stream in the upper troposphere around 30 degrees. And then finally, studies have looked at outgoing long-wave radiation from satellite data. And so what Darren did in his paper is basically look at a number of CMIP-5 global climate models and do a rigorous inner comparison of all these different metrics. So when one moves poleward, do they all move poleward? And he does this in terms of interannual variability and also in terms of the 4 times CO2 response or the climate change response. So this is a sort of complicated figure, but it's a nice synthesis of sort of a lot of the key results in his paper. And this is all this is a cross-correlation table. And so the colors here indicate the strength of the correlation. So you can find your favorite metric, the psi metric, for example, the edge of the Hadley cell. And so this half of the square is the southern hemisphere, and this half is the northern hemisphere. And so if you want to correlate your Hadley cell edge with sort of the sea level pressure maximum here, you can see in the southern hemisphere, on average, the correlation is 0.73, and the asterisk here indicates statistical significance across a number of the models. And so basically you can see that the largest correlations, the most significant correlations are in the bottom left corner here. And so what that suggests is, if you go back to the previous slide, it suggests that basically all of these so-called lower tropospheric metrics, so metrics based on the surface wind, sea level pressure, precipitation minus evaporation, all of these things are very strongly correlated strongly correlated in models sort of in terms of their interannual variability. So when one moves poleward, they all move poleward, basically. And so we have high confidence, I guess, that any of these metrics are measuring things that are relevant for surface fields, surface winds, sea level pressure, and precipitation minus evaporation. Now these other metrics up here, sort of the upper tropospheric metrics, the subtropical jet, tropopause break, and the OLR metrics are much more poorly correlated with the surface-based metrics. And so what basically is going on, which is kind of interesting and we don't really understand yet, is in fact the Hadley cell moving poleward and equatorward is actually more strongly correlated with the strength of these features, so the strength of the subtropical jet and the strength of the tropopause break, rather than their position. And so previous studies that have focused on the position of these features are kind of looking at a different mode of variability in the climate system that isn't necessarily correlated with poleward and equatorward excursions of the Hadley cell edge. And again, I don't think we completely understand that yet, but it's pretty clear in a lot of the analyses we've been doing. In terms of the OLR-based metric, it works pretty well, at least this relative metric works pretty well in terms of interannual variability. But when you look at the climate change response, this starts to become dominated by warming and not by circulation changes. And so for that reason, we also kind of recommend against using that metric. And so if you're interested in surface impacts, sort of the metrics, again, that we recommend are sort of these more what we call lower tropospheric metrics. And so that's basically what Darren's paper has sort of come to the conclusion of. So the second thing that we've tried to do is now sort of standardize the way that these things are calculated. And so Ori Adam, who's a working group member, has spent a lot of effort into coding up basically the same metrics we use in Darren's paper into an open source code package that's now freely available online since January on Zenodo. So anybody can download this if you're interested in comparing these circulation metrics to something you're interested in studying. And so this code can be applied to reanalysis and climate model output very easily. And so the technical documentation, sort of how we go about making sort of the methodological decisions that we made to write this code, is now in a review paper in GMD. And so hopefully that'll be, that's in discussion, so you're welcome to comment on that right now if you like. So what we're doing is we're encouraging, we're certainly not telling people that this is how you should calculate these things, but I think what we're suggesting is that if you come up with a new method or a new sort of finding about tropical widening, that you should at least cross-compare it with these established methods, because that was a lot of the problem in the previous literature, is there was sort of a lot of independent work that was very difficult to compare with one another. And we're hoping that providing something like this, and there's also going to be, I think Ori has error interim data already, sort of the metrics for that already calculated. So we're hoping that this is a good resource for the community, that people interested in studying this problem can use this resource. And hopefully this will help to sort of standardize some of the methodological confusion that had occurred in some previous studies. And then the final point here in terms of metrics is this issue of sort of different studies using different data sets. And I'm not going to dwell on this too much in this presentation. There's going to be more on this in our upcoming working group paper that I'll talk about in just a second. But just sort of to summarize this in a sentence or two, I think a lot of these earlier studies that had documented very high rates of tropical expansion had documented these rates using older generation reanalysis products. And I think in newer generation reanalysis products, the trends are much more modest and much more consistent with what climate models are giving us. And so there'll be much more on that sort of later in some of our future papers, but at least that's kind of the way that I sort of would interpret our findings so far on that issue. Okay. So again, as Paul said, we've made a lot of progress on point one, because we've kind of had the advantage of having sort of twice the number of meetings with the collaboration with this ISSI working group. So we've really done a lot on that. But the second topic, I think within the last 6 months, we've really sort of also made some progress on. And that is trying to make some sort of a more coherent statement about which anthropogenic forcings and modes of natural variability have been important in explaining these recent trends. So now that we have kind of a standard way of quantifying how much the tropics have expanded, we'd like to kind of understand what has caused this expansion. And so, as Paul mentioned, I literally just submitted this paper on Monday, so this is literally just submitted. But this is our working group synthesis paper on these issues. And so we addressed 3 questions in this paper. Do global climate models have a realistic representation of tropical width variability? And then if they do, then we can use the models to answer these other questions. What is the primary cause of the recent tropical expansion? And then when will forced tropical expansion emerge from natural variability in the future? And so again, this has just been submitted, so this is obviously not freely available on the web yet, but you're welcome to contact me personally if you're interested in this, and I'd be happy to sort of give you a copy of the paper if you'd like it. Just to sort of summarize the key conclusions out of this paper, or sort of some of the key things we identified. So there's a number of factors that have contributed, probably the climate model suggests contributed to the recent tropical expansion. And I think chiefly among these are sort of the 3 things I have on this slide. The first is increasing greenhouse gases, but primarily, and I think this is something that comes out in our paper, there's a hemispheric asymmetry there, that it's really more prominent in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere. Consistent with previous studies, stratospheric ozone depletion in the southern hemisphere summer has been important, particularly in the sort of late 20th century period when the ozone hole developed. And then finally, which has drawn a lot of attention in a number of previous studies, which are cited here, is the role of ocean-atmosphere coupling in the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And so I think in this audience, I think many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with the evolution of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and Pacific sea surface temperatures, but it's useful just to kind of refresh our memory about what happened. And so if you look at this time series of PDO, during the 1980s and 1990s, there were relatively warm sea surface temperatures in sort of the eastern tropical Pacific, so you had sort of more El Nino-like conditions on average, and then the PDO kind of switched to more of a La Nina-like state, a cooler phase in the early 2000s. And so this transition between positive ENSO/PDO and negative ENSO/PDO occurred sort of in the late 1990s. And so a number of recent papers have talked about this and how it's relevant for the so-called hiatus or slowdown in global temperature warming in the early 2000s. But as noted by Bob Allen and Dylan Amaya in our U.S. Clivar newsletter issue, this is also quite relevant for the tropical widening case, because we know that during El Nino events and during positive PDO, the Hadley cell tends to be slightly narrower, and that during sort of La Nina events or negative PDO, the Hadley cell tends to be a little bit wider. And so all else being equal, when the PDO transitions from positive to negative, you would expect kind of a boost on any background widening signal caused by just the change in phase of the PDO toward its negative phase. So anyway, these conclusions here I think are consistent with previous studies on these topics. One thing that we've identified in this paper that maybe is less appreciated is the role of internal atmospheric variability. And this is also discussed nicely by Isla Simpson in our recent article in the U.S. Clivar Variations. And you can go back to our webinar from a couple weeks ago where Isla presented her work on that topic. But this is a nice kind of summary figure that illustrates this issue. And so this is again from this paper that we just submitted. But this is the same model. It happens to be the Australian model, the CSIRO model. It uses the same forcing, so the same changes in greenhouse gases and ozone, and the same sea surface temperature, so the same observed evolution of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And yet, if you do 10 runs of this model, you find this range of rates of tropical widening over the period 1979 to 2009. And so you can see that even if you know sort of the factors on the previous slide here, increasing greenhouse gases, ozone depletion, and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, what you find is you still have sort of chaotic internal atmospheric variability, largely sort of eddy mean flow interaction around the edges of the Hadley circulation that are driving large variations in rates of tropical expansion, much greater than sort of what's in the reanalyses here, and also what's much less. And so I think it also suggests that there's a lot of internal atmospheric variability that's important in explaining what's happened. And unfortunately, a lot of that is probably not predictable. It's just kind of the evolution of the climate system over the last 30 to 40 years. So with that sort of in note, I just want to note quickly before I turn it back over to Paul, one other study that's come out of working group members, and this is by Xiaowei Quan, who works at NOAA, who's a member of our working group. And he's nicely kind of looked at this issue of, there's so much natural variability, so much internal variability. So what can we say about the forced response versus internal variability? And so he's looked at this in a number of these large ensembles, so these basic climate model runs that are run many times using the same conditions to kind of gain a sense of what is the natural variability. And so each gray line here is an individual run from, this is the NCAR CSM model, and this is the Canadian large ensemble. And what you can see here is this is starting at sort of present day conditions and moving out throughout the 21st century. And what he's arguing is that in the CSM model, which has a more realistic representation of variability compared to the observations, which are these black lines down here, that basically, based on present day conditions, you wouldn't expect to sort of be able to detect statistically a forced signature of tropical widening until sometime in the mid-21st century, just because of all this noise that I was just mentioning. And so I think it's important when you're trying to study this issue to look at a lot of different sort of model ensemble members and not just a couple, because the role of internal atmospheric variability is one that I think we've been starting to appreciate of how important it actually is on this particular problem. So With that, I will turn it back over to Paul, who's going to talk about sort of our recent work on the regional impacts of tropical widening.
Thanks, Kevin. The regional impact of widening is actually closely linked with the forced versus the naturally varying width of the tropics. And Kevin actually kept this in mind in his recent work, regional and seasonal characteristics for the recent expansion of the tropics, with the idea that the forced widening of the tropics may have a different pattern than the natural variability in the width of the tropics. So if you look at observed trends in sea level pressure, one thing they found is that during September, October, and November, over the North Atlantic, you see a strong dipole shift with respect to the climatological ridge over the North Atlantic. So that suggests a strong poleward shift over the Atlantic. Whereas if you look at the trend and observations that's congruent with the PDO doesn't seem to have any real impact over there, over the North Atlantic, in either observations or models. An interesting thing to point out in their work is that the forced response in climate models also does not explain this strong shift seen here in observations. So in most other longitudes and during most other seasons, the widening seen in observations is within the range of natural swings in models. So this is longitude by longitude. But models don't seem to capture the North Atlantic shift in year-to-year variability or in the forced response. So there is something of an unexplained poleward shift over the North Atlantic. But this idea that you may detect regional shifts sooner than shifts in the zonal mean because of cancellation between one region and another is something that, as a group, we are very interested in. And in our recent variations newsletter, Jacob Sheff illustrated some of these regional impacts. Instead of looking at the sea level pressure ridge itself, Jacob looked at impacts in terms of aridity. So in his figure here, we're looking at March, April, and May climatological aridity in contours and trends simulated during the 21st century in the shading. So bright blue is decreasing aridity, and it's statistically significant. The bright red is increasing aridity, and it's statistically significant. And the whitish grayish shades are where it's not significant in most of the models. And the first thing you'll notice if you look at the figure for a moment is that the strongest changes in aridity are over the ocean. Jacob argues that this isn't as important as changes in aridity over land. If you look at changes in aridity over land, they actually, for the most part, they're smaller than changes of aridity over the ocean. So that may be considered a good thing. This land aridification is also seasonal. In many regions, it's strongest during the springtime. And of course, it's regional. One of the few regions that shows robust aridification in their simulations are, for example, the Mediterranean. You look like year-round, you expect aridification over the Mediterranean. So there's one region where you may look for a strong signal. But what about the oceans? Because of course we rely on the oceans for marine productivity. And of course, the aridification of the ocean is going to affect sea surface salinity, but Carrie Cook and Vizzy looked at expanding with the tropics impact over the ocean. They looked at changes in the sea level pressure, so subtropical ridge, so it's being shown in the figure to the right. So you have trends shaded versus the climatology and the purple contours. And reanalyses agree that we're experiencing a poleward shift in the subtropical ridge. But what does this mean for the ocean? Well, oceanic gyres and upwelling should change in response to these changing sea level pressure patterns. It experience changing surface wind stress, which will impact the ocean. But land-sea heating contrasts and topography complicate this response. So if you, Carrie, looked through observational studies of the changing and upwelling, and most of these, I mean, there's so much to look at that each of these studies focuses on one area at a time. So Carrie kind of synthesized this into one paper, and the result is that there's not one conclusion you can make by looking at each of these regions individually. That, oh yes, you expect global, a widening of the tropics, and you expect the following changes in the gyres in each basin. You have different responses in different basins. And some of this is because of land-sea heating contrasts and the topography, so the shape of the shoreline, for example. But, and so this is, you have disagreement from one region to another. You also have disagreement from one model to another. But if you look at the ensemble mean, it looks like you can expect a poleward shift in upwelling. So there seems to be some, there's a weak tendency towards a poleward shift in upwelling. But the biological response is going to be uncertain because you have changes in upwelling in some regions, and this is going to be result. If you have increased upwelling, you'll have increased nutrient availability, but you'll have depleted dissolved oxygen, and that can result in hypoxia over large regions. So the previous slide I showed you the observed trends in reanalyses, and models agree by mid-21st century here over the South Atlantic you can expect a poleward shift, and this is expected to be even stronger by the end of the 21st century. Now, as Kevin mentioned earlier, we've made a lot of progress on metrics as our two working groups have worked in synergy with each other. We've also made recent progress on the variability. And we have work in progress on the regional impacts. We have a Nature Climate Change Review paper that we have just submitted. Again, it's accepted in principle, so we'll be keeping our eyes open for that. And I have a regional overturning paper with a working group. Focusing on a metric related to the stream function metric, but from one region to another. Of course, we have our AGU session this fall, and other upcoming activity is something like a BAMS article, possibly with the ISSI working group. This is one of the big conversations we had in Switzerland with the ISSI group was, what should the scope of this BAMS article be? And so that's something that we're working on as a working group is scoping out this possible BAMS article that would be possibly a wider synthesis than the papers we've written so far. So that's where we're at, and that's where we are going. Any questions?